little bit of the history of this genre, and I'll be giving a demonstration of the software so you can go home and do it yourself. So first things first, who am I? Who is Vinosci? Well, I'm Vinosci. That has been my stage name for the better part of 2 decades, going on 13 or so years at this point. And through the internet, I have been sharing and releasing music made by reprogramming the original Nintendo Game Boy. I'm gonna pause the music real quick. We'll go back to that. Made by reprogramming and modifying the original Nintendo Game Boy. So this is one of my 2 personal Game Boys. As you can see, it has a custom clear shell, as well as a backlight so that it is more performance oriented. And over the years, I've played a number of anime conventions. I've traveled all over the United States and ventured a little bit into Canada. And I even ended up writing my undergraduate thesis on programming the original Nintendo Entertainment System. So through all that, I have come to talk to you today about chiptune. Now, what is chiptune? Chiptune is electronic music made by utilizing the sounds and limitations of vintage video game consoles and computers. So when we're referring to vintage video game consoles and computers, we're talking about really old. So we're talking about 80s and 90s. That includes the original Nintendo and the NES, the early home computers such as the Commodore 64 or the Commodore Amiga, as well as stuff that's a little more modern. There we have a Toshiba Libretto laptop that ran Windows 98. There was a DOS version as well. Game Boy Advance released in 2003. I would say anything up to and including the PlayStation 1 era, around 1995, is really core chiptune, but obviously extending into the 2000s as well. And so out of this DIY culture with these machines, chiptune kind of started to form. But one thing that I want to drive home is that chiptune is not video game music. This is really its own art form, totally detached from these devices and their original purpose. I believe in a Vice interview, Alex Luma, aka I Am Your Destruction, said, "I want the music to speak for itself rather than the hardware used to make it. The first thing they think of Game Boys is video games, Pokemon and Nintendo, but no, this is a tiny piece of hardware with an incredible synthesizer that does so much more than what you've heard from soundtracks like Kirby's Dream Land. It's lo-fi dance music," he adds. "It's making art with tiny machines. So what if it's a Game Boy?" And I think that sums it up really well. The approach to chiptune is really more of one of a hacker culture and a DIY culture, where you're taking something designed for one purpose and you're reprogramming it and you're pushing it to do something totally and completely different. And that's really the method of making chiptune. And the mindset of making chiptune is about working with more is less. And it really is not about the video games at all. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So how did we get here? How did we come from these commercial products being released in the 80s and 90s to now having this subculture of hacking and DIY music? Well, it actually all started all the way back in the 70s with a couple bands that were using very simple synthesizers to make music. The first 2 that really, I think, start the chiptune sound is Kraftwerk and Yellow Magic Orchestra, especially Yellow Magic Orchestra. The works of Ryuichi Sakamoto and his compatriots really defined not only chiptune music, but also a lot of video game music in the 80s and the 90s as well. But at the time, in the 70s, the sounds that they were using, let me play a little Yellow Magic Orchestra for you real quick. I did not drag it into iTunes. One moment. SoulSeek downloads, downloading, complete, where is it? There we go. So this is Yellow Magic Orchestra. Let me play a little bit for you. So as you hear, it's kind of these simple sounds, these square waves and sounds that we often associate with classic video games, but at the time, these were not the sounds of classic video games. These were what was coming out new. These were the cutting edge synthesizers of the 70s and the early 80s. And these would be the same synthesizers that a decade, 2 down the line would actually be put in the Game Boys, not because they're retro sounding, but because this is what was cutting edge in the 80s and the 90s. And so I would say that if we're going to talk about chiptune, we got to play a homage to Yellow Magic Orchestra. But after that, we really start to see the birth of this genre with the releases of two pieces of software. On the left, we have Sound Monitor 1.0 for the Commodore 64, released in 1986. And on the right, we see the Ultimate Sound Tracker, written in 1987. And this is really what I would mark as the start of chiptune for a number of reasons. The first thing is that this is the release of music software that was really meant to be in the box. You know, this time in the 80s, we start to see music studios around the world become more computerized and start to move away from analog, from tape, but there wasn't really a good way for your average Joe Schmo to make music at home, right? It required, if you had a computer, it still required a large amount of outboard gear, drum machines, synthesizers, DAT tape, all sorts of things. And so with the release of Sound Monitor 1.0, this was a really good way to just directly control your computer. No external sound needed. And as you'll notice, we kind of start to also see a standardization of a visual language for this software as well, where the music is broken into these columns. And this software, broken down in columns, is what we call a music tracker. And that is kind of what has become the default style of making chiptune music, originating all the way back in 1986. So we can see it a little bit here on the Commodore. The Commodore had 3 sound channels. It's known as the SID chip. So you can see 1, 2, 3 sound channels here that you were able to control. The music would scroll vertically from the top to the bottom, which each of these representing a note and an instrument value. So this is how you would shape and sequence the data. And it looks a little complicated, but then when the Commodore Amiga came out a couple of years later and the software came out 1 year later, we start to see something a lot more intelligible. So you can see here, the song would scroll vertically. You'll see this a little bit better when we do the software demonstration. But you can have the notes here. You know, there's your G sharp. There's an instrument. There's your volume, and then this is your step. So each one of these, for your musically inclined, each one of these is 1/16th note, and the software would scroll vertically like such. And so the Commodore 64 was able to do synthesis, but with the Amiga, it had enough RAM and enough internal memory, as well as the advent of the floppy disk, where now artists were able to sequence samples. So there was an expansion cartridge for the Amiga that let you record audio in. You would save, you know, we're talking tiny, tiny sound fragments, you know, stuff like that. You would put that on a floppy disk, load them up into your software, and now, without the need of any external gear, synthesizers, whatever, you could sequence full songs. So I'm going to play a little bit of what that early Amiga music sounded like. This is an excerpt from a performance in New York by Citrix. So obviously that's a sample from a very famous big band song. He sampled that into the Amiga and then has added bass and stuff on top of it. And then earlier in that same presentation, we can hear something a little clearer. The bass doesn't really go through the projector. The projector does not like this sound. Anyway, you get the idea. So he was sequencing samples, and this was really the start of chiptune as we know it. And then later in the 90s, we start to see variations on a theme. So these are more or less the same type of software. You see we have the same tracker interface. On the left, we have Fast Tracker. This was made for Windows 98 machines and utilized the Sound Blaster sound cards. So this was before computers could handle digital or CD audio. This is before MP3s. Computer sound cards had basically a synthesizer in them for video games. And this software let you edit and sequence that synthesizer directly. And then on the right, we have 1995's, it used to be called Pro Tracker, now called OpenMPT, also sometimes known as Mod Plug Tracker. This is obviously a Windows 7 version, but it's the same principle where you're sequencing samples, and you know, it was a really efficient way to write music. Not only was it an efficient way to write music, it was also an efficient way to distribute music. Again, we're talking, dial-up internet speeds. We're talking really before people were storing mass amounts of MP3s on their computers. What you could do is you could write your song using samples. You could compress it into a handful of kilobytes, and then you send it off to someone else, and they could play it back using their software. And this is kind of the birth of what we consider these are called mod files. And these are files that contain all the sample data, or in the case of something that uses synthesis, all the synthesizer data, and it would compress it down, and you could share them on forums or IRC or whatever you were up to in the 90s. It's also a good point to say that because of its ease of access for these softwares in the 80s as well as in the 90s, this became the default way for a lot of early electronic music, not even music that would be labeled as chiptune or video game music. We see the births of genres such as drum and bass and acid house out of the UK and Chicago respectively, all kind of coming back to trackers, especially drum and bass out of London in the 1990s. A lot of these artists didn't have studio space, they didn't have access to $100 samplers or things of that nature, and so they would just sample their drums into their sequencer and smash it out. And then in the 2000s, this is really where things started to go crazy. With the release of a number of pieces of software, most notably Little Sound DJ for the original Nintendo Game Boy, which released in 2000, Nerd Tracker 2, which was a DOS application that let you sequence the original Nintendo, and 1990, that says 94, it should be 98, 1998's Nano Loop, which was a different approach to sequencing the Game Boy sound card. You can see it doesn't use a tracker interface, it uses something, if you're familiar with step sequencers or drum machines, this might look a little more familiar to you. But the advent of these really brought a new wave of interest to chiptune. So a lot of the home computing revolution, with the exception of the Commodore 64, was happening over in Europe. The Commodore Amiga was not really something we had a huge community for in the United States, and it wasn't until MS-DOS, Windows 98, that we really started to see home computers emerge in the United States as these tools for music creation. So there wasn't like this precedent for nostalgia the same way there was in London. Whereas now in the United States, because Nintendo was such a popular thing, you have people who have a lot of nostalgia for the original Nintendo Game Boy now having direct access to, if you guys are gonna talk, you can do it in the hall, please. Sorry, thank you. So you now have artists who have direct access to these devices that they had laying around their houses, and as a result, it became not only a very intriguing way of making music. Oh, here's this thing that's been rattling around in my junk drawer for 10 years, but also was very inexpensive. This is we're still at kind of the advent of home computers becoming the default for electronic music, and so to have something that you could take with you, a Game Boy back in 2000 probably cost like $20. You'd order a cartridge. One of these, this is an actual Little Sound DJ cartridge. You order one of these from a mysterious Swedish wizard, and for less than $100, you have yourself a sequencer, sample synthesizer, runs on 4 AA's, you can take it with you, and that became really appealing. And then of course, obviously sequencing the NES became hugely appealing as well, not only for nostalgia reasons, but like I mentioned, because these early video game consoles had these early synthesizers in them, the same ones that were cutting edge in the end of the 70s when Yellow Magic Orchestra and Kraftwerk were releasing records. These are now lo-fi, cheap synthesizers that were, for their cost and hardware efficiency, being put into these synthesizers, these video game consoles, rather. So I'm going to give a quick demonstration. We're going to be going into Game Boy music a lot going forward, so I'm going to give a little demonstration of what the original NES can do. This is Chibi Tech's Love is Insecurable. Hopefully it does not sound too bad. Oh. So this is all Nerd Tracker 2, using to control the original Nintendo Entertainment System. I'm gonna let this play for a second so you can kind of get a feel for it. Famicom sound like it's talking. You'll hear that in a second. It sounds like it's saying, "Your love is insecurable." Really technical, fine-sounding things. You know, she's emulating human voice with just a square wave. And so out of this kind of ingenuity, we really start to see a community form. And so after the release of Little Sound DJ, we really start to see the first appearances of chiptune performances. So this is a smattering of photos from two major event series, the first being Blip Fest, which was held in New York, Tokyo, Melbourne, and one time in Aalborg. And that ran from 2005 to 2012. And then after that stopped running, the Australians took up the mantle with Square Sounds, which happened in Tokyo and Melbourne from 2013 to 2020. And basically, the Game Boy really launched all of this into happening. Suddenly, people had these cheap, portable synthesizers that they were able to take with them and make music, and it was new, right? This was before kind of this had become, you know, the thing it is now. You know, this was pre like the retro revival we're seeing today. It really was just very punk. It was people taking these devices and reprogramming them and hacking them and using them to just party, basically. So, you know, we see here some artists, Chiptune from the UK using an original Nintendo Game Boy. This one has been modified with RCA ports. I actually have one like that right here. You can see this one has been modified even further for live performance with a number of audio outputs. I'll go more into that later. We have Torietta from Japan. She has kind of graduated from the chiptune circles and is now just a full-blown idol. She does music for animes, and it all started from bringing Game Boys to little raves. We have a very young picture of Anamanaguchi up here. If you're familiar with them, they've recently gotten a lot of widespread appeal. They did the soundtrack for the Scott Pilgrim video game, as well as the soundtrack for the Netflix show, and all of that was also done fully accurately on original NES hardware. Another thing about the chiptune scene is, as you see these lights and visuals, there was always this mentality that the video artists would be elevated to the same level as the performance, in the same way that people were reprogramming the Game Boy and the NES and the Genesis to make new and exciting music. Visual artists were reprogramming and circuit bending and making things to just totally recontextualize. You know, we're really not talking about video games here. People aren't going to these things and playing Mario music or playing Zelda music. They're just taking these very personal electronics, working within their limitations, and making something really incredible. And so these two events have kind of petered out, but a lot of these artists are still very much active in their own local scenes. Speaking of local scenes, another event that has emerged in the last years is Bit by Bit. Disclaimer, this is the one that I organize. I did not start it. I was handed the mantles in 2017, but this is Chicago's own chiptune and chiptune adjacent event. And I have really tried to curate this into what chiptune is and what chiptune kind of is evolving into. So as I'll talk about a little later, you know, the Game Boy stuff has kind of moved on, but there's artists who are taking that influence, taking the same sense of working within the limitations and pushing it towards other genres of music or other mediums. And so these are some photos from a show that was actually shot by this photographer, Chiptography. She's kind of become the default for chiptune shows. So this was my I made it moment, was when she showed up to one of these events. But it's one of those things that I'm just like so grateful to have been a part of, and so honored to have been invited to take the reins, because we're still pushing this music. You know, the big events have kind of gone out of their way, but in this little pocket in Chicago, we're still trying to keep it alive. Maybe not directly, maybe it's not all Game Boy music, but it's all stuff that's got that same soul and that same mouthfeel. And actually, there's one this coming Friday. So if you're interested, you can talk to me about that after. It should be a lot of fun. And then, so you can see here we have the visual component as well. We always book video artists to go along with our music. So where are we now? You know, chiptune started at a time when retro gaming was not so retro. Now some of these things are antiques. You know, games like Shovel Knight and the ilk have kind of pushed this retro revival into a new era. So where does chiptune as a musical genre stand? Well, in the same way that punk evolved into post-punk and rock evolved into post-rock and prog rock, I would argue that we're now in the era of post-chiptune. In the same way that those musical tools from the 80s and 90s informed the chiptune creation tools of the mid-2000s, now we're seeing the snake eat its own tail, and those chiptune tools from the 2000s are now inspiring the next wave of musical equipment. So I would think the first really major one that sparked this is this device right here, released in 2015, called the NerdSec, SEQ. And what this was is it took the same interface that was used to program the Nintendo Game Boy, and it let you sequence any modular synthesizer. So this is Eurorack stuff. You have to wire it all together, is basically the scoop. So this let you sequence that the same way you would sequence a Game Boy or use this tracker software. And through that, a lot of chiptune artists started jumping from Game Boys and NES to modular synthesis and other synthesizers as well. Underneath it, I have the Roland MC303. This is arguably not a classic chiptune device by definition, but was one of the first all-in-one production stations released in the early 2000s. This gave you bass and synthesizers and drums, but you couldn't add your own samples. So it was all what you got given. And I think this is really carries on the spirit of chiptune, where you're having to work within these limitations. You can't expand it, you got what you got, and you gotta be creative. And so that's really the mindset of chiptune, is this working without almost. And so through these two, we start to see a further evolution. This is a device called the M8, which I actually have here. This is, thank you. This is an evolution of the Game Boy as well. As you can see, it has the same 4 face buttons, an A and a B, and a start and a select. And this is basically a fully souped up Game Boy. Exact same interface that I will show you for the Nintendo Game Boy, but this lets you sequence samples, synthesizers, anything you would want. I use this as a part of a larger synthesizer setup, but the fact that it has that same instantly accessible interface, I think, is very appealing to a lot of artists who are coming from chiptune. And not only that, artists who are new to it are now being exposed to the efficiency that was mandated by these tracker interfaces. So then we also see on the right a piece of software called Renoise and the Polygon Tracker. These take more from the old Commodore Amiga systems, and they just let you sequence any music. The Renoise runs on a computer, samples, plugins, whatever. It's a modern piece of music software with all the bells and whistles, just instead of sequencing notes on a staff, you can sequence them all tracker style. And lastly, this is a very interesting piece of gear. If we go back to Nanoloop from 1998, that same developer ended up taking that Game Boy, removing the Game Boy, and so now you just get the buttons and a bunch of LEDs. And it basically breaks down to the same piece of software, specifically the Game Boy Advance version of Nanoloop that was released later on the Game Boy Micro. And it turned it into its own standalone device. And this has MIDI and analog sync. It's very full-featured, but it really is the Game Boy Advance software without the Game Boy. And so that's really interesting. I think it's a very clear piece of post-chiptune, where we're seeing what influenced chiptune now influence stuff that is no longer chiptune or post-chiptune. Is there any questions up to this point? Great, I'm doing my job well then. Then we are going to go into our demonstration. So, piece of software I will be demoing today is called Little Sound DJ, or LSDJ. This was, like I mentioned, a piece of Game Boy software released for the original Game Boy in 2000 with many iterations. Hold up the cartridge again. And what I'm going to be showing you is exactly the same software that I'm running on my Game Boys at my performance this afternoon. So let's just get right into it. Tab over to the software. Great. So this is Little Sound DJ. This is a blank file on Little Sound DJ. The Nintendo Game Boy had a sound chip that had 4 sound channels. You have 2 what are called pulse channels, a wave channel, and a noise channel. So let us start by sampling these sounds. Let's see what they sound like. So pulse 1, we're going to start by double-clicking the A button. I'm using a PlayStation controller, but I will be calling out the Game Boy buttons if this is for you for later. So to make a new chain, we're going to double-click the A button, and that generates a new chain. You move around the menus by holding select and using the D-pad. So this is our main screen. This is where we're going to do playback from. Each of these little blocks is called a chain. So if we hit select and right, we're going to go into the chain screen. And a chain is a series of measures. So if we go in, we have a new phrase. And then if we go left, select and right once more, we'll enter the phrase. And now this is something that should be sort of familiar if you're familiar with music software. This is 16 steps, one measure broken into 16th notes. So let's have a new note and let's listen to that first pulse wave. Why don't I have sound? One moment. I should have sound, it was working. There we go. So that's your pulse wave. You know, that's the one everyone knows. And the pulse comes in 4 flavors. It comes in 25%, or 12%, 25%, 50%, and 75%. And you get 2 of those. So you have pulse 1, and then you have the same thing mirrored onto channel 2. The third channel is called the wave channel, and this is really what makes the Game Boy sound card so interesting. This is a multi-purpose wave table. So I will break down what that means. So we're going to go select and right again to move from the song to the chain, set up a new chain, and let's go into the phrase. So this is your wave instrument. As you notice, it looks a little different than the pulse channels. And if we go in, this is our synth screen. And if we go, so that's select and up, and then select and left, we can actually see our waveform. It's a sawtooth wave. So what we're going to do to kind of show you this is I'm going to show you what you can do. So like I said, this is a more advanced synthesizer than the other was. So we can actually have a start volume and an end volume for this instrument. And as we step through it, you can see the wave will evolve a little bit. And then if we listen to that, it kind of sounds like this. And that's, you know, kind of dubsteppy, kind of modern. Another thing that the wave channel can do is very low bit samples. So let's go in, change that to the samples. And there's a lot of classic drums that come stock with Little Sound DJ. This is, of course, 9 of 9s. I love that clap. But you also have different things such as, or you can actually have different vocal samples, or my favorite is using it for piano samples, which we'll demo a little later. And then the last channel is the noise channel. And this is really a very interesting one. So check this out. Pretty cool, right? It's, you know, white noise, but if we shorten that a little bit and actually make sure that it is a noise instrument, suddenly we can make So as you can see, you can get really creative with these 4 channels. So we're going to explore these a little deeper. We're actually going to write a song together. So let's start with our pulse 1, and we're going to write, let's write like a little arpeggio. So let's go to new instrument. You can double click the A button on a phrase or instrument to generate a new one. We're going to make that short, and we're going to make it a little quieter. And we're going to just go. And then obviously that's note, octave, instrument. I don't want to assume anyone here doesn't have the same breadth and musical knowledge. So we're going to pick up the tempo a little bit. We're going to go up to 140. That's a little faster. And we listen to this. All right, now we're chip tuning. But I think we can make that sound a little more interesting. It sounds a little plain. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down here to what are called tables. And this is really the bread and butter of LSDJ. This is kind of where trackers start to get their sauce, because unlike in traditional music software where you have to do a lot of dragging around, you can kind of change instruments in almost this programming fashion. So this is the table screen. We have volume, transpose, command 1, and command 2. And as you can see, when the instruments are playing, it runs through this sequence. So what we can do with this is we can do a lot of really creative things. We can go to our W command. So here's all the different commands. You can see what they break down to at the top. And that's also a double press of A. And we're going to go to our W command for waveform. And we're going to set a couple of these. And we're going to have it so it starts wide and then kind of slams short. So, all right, now we're getting a little bit more of a pluck. What we can do then is we can have an H command, which will have it so that when it reaches the H, it's going to go back to that row 0. If any of you are familiar with BASIC, it works the same as a go-to command. And if we slow it down using a G command, which is for groove, you can see it a little more succinctly. Cool. So now we got our first little pattern. Let's add some percussion. So we're going to just add some hi-hats. So we're going to go back to our wave channel. We're going to make it really short. We're actually going to make it even shorter. We're going to go into our table, and we're going to go here, and we're going to use a K command for kill. And what that does is it just stops all sound. So now we can get a note that's even shorter. And if we wanted, we could even make it more staccato. I will say if you're working in an emulator, oftentimes the noise channel does not emulate so well. There are emulators that are better than this. I'm using OpenMU. If you're on Windows, I recommend using MGB for accuracy. So we can hear, great, now it's nice and short. So we're just gonna add some hi-hats on the offbeats, like that. Great. So now we got our little instrument, and we're gonna add a clap as well, or a snare. Oh, yeah, let's hear it out. All right, cool. So we're going to add a snare as well. So we're going to go back, new instrument, set the length nice and short. We're going to go to the shape. So we want something a little darker. All right, I like that. We can make that even a little bit spicier. So we're going to go to our O command for panning. Don't ask. And we're going to set left, right, and then both. One thing that you kind of have to consider with chiptune is because you have 4 sound channels, you kind of can lean on what the human brain will assume it's hearing. So in this case, we're running a very simple script. It's going to go hard panned left, hard panned right, and then finish on both. And as a result of your ear hearing these 2 things at different times, it's going to think this is a much wider sound than it actually is, even though it's really just a stereo mix. So now, let's add that here. Great. So now we got that. I'm also going to make a blank phrase. This is just helpful for when you only want one channel playing at once, or select number. So I'm having a blank with a kill. This will make it so that anything that plays into this, if we have it running as a sequence, will stop. So now, all right, cool. that's sounding not bad. So now we gotta add, of course, the best part, gotta add some bass and some drums. You know, what's dance music without drums? So we're gonna go that new instrument. We're gonna go over to our phrase screen, and you know, let's go back to let's make a new kit. Kit. We're gonna go back to that 909, which I love, and we can just go. All right, that sounds okay. I like that snare. I think I'm gonna change that to the clap, personally. But I kind of don't like that kick. I don't really think it has a lot of punch. So we're gonna actually program our own kick. No samples required. And this is the same method that you know, if you're using old analog drum machines, this is how the kick drum is made on those as well. So we're gonna wave instrument. We're gonna make a new instrument. We were on synth 0. We're gonna go to synth 1, and we're gonna set play to manual. And what that means is it's not gonna, in the previous one we showed that it would step through the wave table, but for this one, when it's set to manual, it's not gonna move until we give it explicit instructions. And we're gonna set it to a sine wave, which sounds like this. I'm sorry, sometimes I get lost. Pretty good. We're gonna make that a little louder. And we wanna turn that into a kick. So how we're gonna do that, so we're gonna go back to our handy dandy table, double click the A button to make a new one, and we're gonna use the P command for pitch bend. And what this will do is it's going to say, you can see here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna say, slam the note down as fast as you possibly can. Oh, one thing I totally forgot to mention, as you'll notice, everything is in 2 digits. This is because in order to save screen space as well as efficiency, everything is denoted in hexadecimal. And I think breaking down hexadecimal is a little outside of the scope of this talk, but what I will say is that instead of digits going 0 through 9, they go 0 through 9, and then they go A through F to represent the numbers 0 through 16. And so you can now have, with only 2 digits, the values between 00 and 255. And if you're a music person and you do MIDI stuff, you know that 255 is a magic number. So if we trigger this now, it kind of makes an interesting sound. That's close, but that's not quite what we want. So we're actually going to go and use that K command again to just stop it short. All right, and now that's a lot louder, and we can actually pitch it up and down. Great, so we're gonna replace these kicks with this new MIDI kick that we have programmed. And then let's listen to this again. All right, now we're starting to get a much fuller sound. So what we're gonna do next is we're gonna add in the bass. So we're gonna go new instrument. And we're gonna go back to that first one. We're gonna increase the speed, so it kind of does the wub wub sound a little faster. I think you actually have to have it smaller for the. There you go. So now we can program a very simple bass line. My trick is always just to do octaves. It's from the 80s, you know, it freaks out sometimes. So now, and we can make that a little spicier too. We can use the slide command. So now we have a note that it's going to slide to this note. Cool. That sounded pretty good. Let's add one more thing. Let's add a lead on top of that. So we're going to go back, start a new sequence, and we're going to just make a nice, pretty easy lead. So we're going to go to new instrument. We're going to set it like that. We're going to have it cut off, and we're just going to go C, E, A, pretty good, but I think we can make that even prettier. So we're going to go to our V command, which lets us add a little bit of vibrato. And now, the V command, in combination with the L command that we used earlier, that lets you slide to a note, I'm going to just punch this in so you can hear the whole thing, we can really start to make something that's very expressive and not static and not simple sounding. So I like to increase the vibrato a little bit over time. So vibrato value 1, vibrato value 2, vibrato value 3, and then it's going to slide to this next note. And we're going to do the same thing again. Same thing with this. We're going to go L, where the digit after it is the speed at which it's going to slide to. I like a nice slow one. It feels very melancholy. I really like that sound a lot. And let's do one more L command here. And then we'll take a listen. So L command, and let's add a quick vibrato, and one more. Great, so now, all right, and then with that first one, we're not done. We're just getting started. We're not done. But since you does anyone have any questions up to this point? Because if not, I'm going to just kind of keep going over cool things you can do with the Game Boy. All right. Great.
Like, for people coming into this, there's so much history,
right?
And compared to modern interfaces, crazy.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think once you...
Do you start here for people coming in, or you go with this traditional sequencer and kind of work back into this?
I think it really depends on where you're at musically. Like, I think if you have kind of a familiarity with piano roll already, piano roll being the music for so you know music notation where basically there's a piano on the left side of the screen and you see notes kind of hit it up and down. There's no whiteboard, so I'd say if you start there, tracking is not really difficult. It is basically the same interface, even more so if you're familiar with what I would call TR sequencing. So that's like the 808 or the 303, kind of that linear 16-step sequencing. I would say this is very familiar, but I started with trackers. I'm classically trained. I've been playing violin and then oboe and then bassoon and then the Game Boy. So I would say starting here is pretty good. I think just like diving in the deep end is really good. Like I mentioned, if you're not really attracted to the 8-bit sounds, or you want to just learn the tracker without having to learn kind of other stuff on top of it, that's where a piece of software like Renoise would come in, which is really a very, very full-featured piece of music software. The only quirk is that all the sequencing is done in this tracker interface. I started with this, and it has pretty much made learning any other piece of tracker software like a 1-hour ordeal. And so that's kind of, I think, one of the benefits with tracker software is the fact that once you kind of learn one, you kind of learn them all, because they're all standardized, they're in hexadecimal, and they all are laid out more or less the same. It becomes very easy to do once you've kind of done one. But I won't lie, there is a bit of a learning curve to this. So I hope, did that answer your question? I kind of babbled for a second.
No, it's good.
Okay, cool. Any other questions before we keep going? Cool. So we got this pattern right here. And it's okay, but one thing that we might want to do is add like some delay or some reverb to this. Now, obviously, we don't have any effects on this. So one way we could do it is we could, copy this channel over here, and we can offset it all by one note. But now we're using 2 channels to basically have one sound. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to program the delay straight into this first sequence. So we're going to offset it by one whole step, and I'm going to use select, my square button is my select, and then B and then A to copy the instrument. And we're going to have the exact same instrument, exact same table, but we're going to make the volume a little lower. And then we're going to go and we're going to offset this whole melody by one step. So that's E4, E5, C5, C4, A4, and then A5 back where it loops. And now we have a much more interesting sound. Check this out. Right, and you're tricking the ear into thinking, oh, it's processing an echo, but it's not. It's just one channel. That's why that sounds good. And then if we wanted to go even more crazy, we could of course go and do some like left-right panning. So now the echo is going to pan left and right as it plays. And that sounds pretty good, and that sounds a lot more complex. And now, if we put it all together, we have a much fuller mix to the music. Cool. I'm going to show you one more trick. Hang on, one more thing. So, one thing that you really can't do is obviously you don't have a lot of polyphony. That is to say, two notes playing at the same time would take up two channels. So one way you could do that very easily, if we duplicate that same pattern across both channels, we actually notice that the instrument has a setting that says PU tune. And what that says is if this instrument is playing on the second channel, we can detune it. So we can do that by just one note, and now we actually have generated a chorus. And that sounds really nice and really lush, but what if we really want to use that other channel? Well, we can use what is called a chord. And this is a very classic video gamey sound, because it was very efficient to make. So let's set our pattern. We're just going to have it like this, and we're going to trim it down so it sounds like this. All right, but we want to have a chord, right? So we're going to go back to our handy-dandy table, and we're going to use the transpose function. And what this is going to do is, in the same way when it reads this code, it's going to go and modify things. We can actually modify the pitch. So we're going to go up a fifth, 7, 9, and then we're going to hop back to that first one. And if we put a G command here, you can see very clearly in slow motion. But if we get rid of it, you have this very classic, you know, and then you start to, hang on. Why is it not? Oh, it's this one. And then you have something really full sounding. So to wrap this up, I'm actually going to pull up what a finished song looks like so we can take a little look here and break down what kind of a finished song looks like. So here you can see at the top, this is kind of my sketch pad where I start to figure out the ideas of the song. And then if we go all the way down, this is the whole bulk of the song. So this song is called Slipstream. Wrote this in like 2018 or something. And the main gimmick is that instead of the wave channel being used for bass, I use it primarily in the song for piano. So these piano chords are actually pitched down. So to save room on the cartridge, I have these very short, I can actually show you. So you can see the sample is at 0.5 speed. If we go up an octave, thank you. If we go up an octave, but if we want them longer, instead of importing a longer sample, which would take up more of the Gameboy's already limited memory, we can take these short samples and we can just have the speed. And now we have these nice. So they're nice and crispy, and I'm just going to play this song out. Are there any other questions? Cool. We'll do a little show and tell at the end. If you want to come up here while this song is playing, I'll show you some of the equipment I got. Otherwise, I'm performing outside at 4:15. I hope you all come. It should be a lot of fun. I haven't played a 100% Game Boy set in quite a few years, so I'm playing a bunch of stuff that that hasn't seen the light of day in maybe 5 or 6 years. So thank you all for coming. I'm gonna play this song as we all know you, and see y'all later.